Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for the week of September 30th, 2023. We dedicate our Freedom Now program to honor the life of Reza Poor. We here at Freedom Now are deeply saddened with his passing on Wednesday, September 27th at the age of 85. He was a former KPFK local station board member, Pacifica National Board member, lead organizer with the KPFK Outreach Committee, and for decades, he brought so many communities across the Pacifica stations together. We'll have a clip, actually, of our Freedom Now ancestor, Didon Kamati, giving a beautiful introduction that really recognizes who Reza Poor was in our community that we'll have after this agenda. For today's program, Sister Luyanda Kumboka brings us our African drumbeat historical calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Blair Kelley, Joel R. Williams, Distinguished Professor in Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, here to discuss her book, Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Crystal Lynn Webster, Assistant Professor of African American History at the University of British Columbia in Canada, here to discuss her book, Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, African American Children in the Antebellum North. We'll also have a prison radio commentaries from Mumia Abu Jamal and Chad Smith. Our music clip mix includes Nicholas Payton, Duke Pearson, Sonny Rollins, Teddy Edwards, Eddie Henderson, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution. And now we'll go to a clip from 2010 KPFK Town Hall meeting where our Freedom Now ancestor Didon Kamati introduced our Iranian elder Reza Poor. This was at an event that honored the former Georgia Congresswoman and presidential candidate, Sister Cynthia McKinney. Didon's beloved introduction of Reza Poor speaks volumes to why we are deeply saddened with Reza's passing. So we honor his journey now as our ancestor.
Okay, I'd like to next bring up Brother Reza. He's going to introduce the new local station board members. I'd like to first say, though, that within Pacifica and KPFK, 90% of the work is done by volunteers. And there's different categories of volunteers. But there are some volunteers who work 20, 30, 40 hours a week, not paid, motivated by commitment to a better world, motivated by commitment of internationalism, motivated by commitment to anti-racism. And sometimes you never see these people. They don't get no acknowledgement. And Reza is a veteran, is a warrior, who works behind the scene tirelessly for KPFK. It's powerful to be. Please acknowledge Brother Reza. A very humble brother,
On the behalf of KPFK Outreach Committee, I welcome all of you for your active participation. Anyway, I was going to come up with a proverb, African proverb. It says, until the lions have their own historian, the tales of the hunting have always glorified the hunters. But today is different. We are going to hear from Cynthia and our friend Miguel the tales of the lions, what people are doing around the world against this imperialism, that, people are standing up and saying no more, no more.
Rezapur presente. Reza will call me, sometimes this is Sister Tej, and say, I raised hundreds of dollars for Freedom Now, Tej. He signed up so many people to become members and made sure that Freedom Now had received those pledges because of our radical programming. He was a father and teacher and mentor to many in the community, and especially for younger activists. Ready for revolution, Reza. Rezapur presente.
Man that founded wisdom, and with that getting get overstanding, and knowledge shall be added unto thee. And your way up be good to those people you met, because you would have meet the same people.
Molweni Ekai. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of Tuesday, September 26th. This presentation will highlight significant progressive revolutionary activists and events in the struggle for humanity and spirituality over greed and the ruling class. September 28, 1958, Guinea, West Africa votes no, not only to French colonialism, but votes no to any economic and political ties to France, thereby proclaiming a complete independence from European rule. This mass decision set in motion the development of the most revolutionary African microstate in Africa, laying the groundwork for the development of Pan-Africanism as an objective and ideology of Nkrumahism to racism. September 29, 1965. CIA and its puppets overthrow the progressive democratic government in Indonesia of Sukarno and murder over 500,000 people. Indonesia composes of over 18,110 islands and is the world's largest Muslim country, targeted due to its multitude of natural resources. September 30th, 1975, the military dictatorship called the Derg declares a state of emergency and seizes control over the Ethiopian government, imprisoning His Majesty Haile Selassie Jah and slaughtering students, intellectuals, and trade unionists, ending the longest rule of an emperor in Africa. October 1st, 1949. China, one of the poorest and most divided countries in the world, is liberated under the leadership of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. After 30 years of armed struggle, thereby liberating women, peasants, and working class from centuries of stagnant development. October 2nd, 1800. Nat Turner was born the week before Gabriel Prosser, a well-known rebellious slave leader, was hanged. Nat Turner, a gifted child, believed that God spoke to him directly and commanded him to lead African people to destroy the system of slavery. Nat Turner used religion as a weapon of revolution. October 2nd, 1858, Queen Mary Thomas, was born. She was an African slave rebellion leader in St. Croix, which is part of the U.S. colony in the Virgin Islands today. On October 1st, 1878, she and two other slave women, Rebecca Frederick and Exeline Solomon, aka the Black Amazon, led a revolt and killed many whites and set fire to the plantation houses of white slave owners, which also freed many slaves. October 3rd, 1952. The Mau Mau Rebellion against the British colonial rule in Kenya, East Africa begins. The Mau Mau's major targets were African collaborators with the British, thus beginning the class struggle, which has intensified throughout Africa and the diaspora. The Mau Mau correctly understood that without collaborationists, England could not maintain colonial rule. October 3rd, 1904. The people of Namibia, formerly called Southwest Africa, begin armed struggle against German colonial rule, evolving into total liberation under the leadership of Southwest African People's Organization. This has been Freedom Now at 90.7 FM in Southern California, 98.7 FM in Central California. Freedom Now's mission statement and profile is on the web at kpfk.org under programs. We hope that these reminders of bygone struggle will motivate those in the listening audience not to get frustrated with the slow pace of change. We have a rich history of struggle that has moved world society forward. We would like to have a unity chant of Amandla Awetu, which means all power to the people. So join us as we chant Amandla in response Awetu. Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu, Amandla Awetu.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Professor Blair Kelley, Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor in Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Director of the Center for the Study of the American South, and author of the book Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Kelley.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book, Black Folk?
Well, I met my editor, and he was, like all of us, inundated with the stories of the white working class. Lots of very popular and successful books about the white working class. And he was wondering, well, what is the parallel here? What is the Black working class? And so he came to me with that question. And for me, the answer began in the stories that my family told me. And I wanted to write a book that was capturing the things I knew about them. They were not famous activists. They were not just union organizers, or their lives did not just take place in factory floors. They had full, rich lives, which informed what it meant for them to be working class. And so I wanted to start with their stories and then capture the stories of others, use oral histories to talk about the ways in which I think the Black working class are unique in the American story and have so much to teach all of us about community, about supporting one another, coming together, providing structure in times of dissent and trouble, and really remaking a broader sense of how we can all support one another and be there for each other through difficult times, through the things that Black people have survived before coming to this country and as Americans.
So one of your ancestors was an enslaved blacksmith. Where in Dixie was this ancestor enslaved? When? Do you have any idea of what part of Africa this ancestor came from? Any stories passed down to you about this ancestor, and how and where did he learn smithing?
Well, it's interesting because my grandfather was from Georgia. This is his great-great-grandfather. Henry. He was born in a place probably born in Elbert County, Georgia. I know I could see him there as a young man. And I don't know where he learned smithing. I only discovered that he was a blacksmith in the will of the man who held him in bondage. It was an interesting story. I discovered him through tracing my family line. And I figured out over time, who he probably was using slave schedules. But of course, you can't see most people's names on slave schedules. They weren't recorded that way. They were recorded by color and age. But I can see him there as a person I believe is him consistently. And then I just ran into the will of the man who was holding him in bondage. And I read it. I thought to myself, well, he owns over 200 people. My ancestor's name is probably not there. But something pushed me to read it anyway. And upon reading it, I saw Henry, a blacksmith, there listed in the will. I don't know anything more than that about him. As a free man, he's not able to work as a blacksmith. He is a sharecropper as a free man. And often, like so many other people who gain skills or were passed down skills from their ancestors as enslaved people, as free men, those skills were seen as a threat to free white labor. And oftentimes we're not allowed to do that. And so in my ancestors' case, that seems to have been the same. But I do know that part of my family, they tended to have carpentry skills, masonry skills, blacksmithing skills. My grandfather was a carpenter. My great uncle was a mason. They were builders, but they always had a hard time finding employment in those areas. So I think I have a reason to think that some of those things were passed down over time, but it's hard to put that story back together.
So if I heard you correctly, you were suggesting that white labor objected to skilled Black labor.
Absolutely.
Could you elaborate upon that?
So, Du Bois called it the de-skilling of the former slaves, right? So that the enslaved were depended on for blacksmithing, for masonry work, for brick work, for iron work of all sorts. They were carpenters. They did the construction work to create much of America. And as free people, those jobs paid better. And so were now all of a sudden kept for white men for the most part. Very few Black men were able to work in those skills pretty systematically after enslavement ended. And so part of why the discussion in Florida about the enslaved gaining skills was so ridiculous is that oftentimes those skills were African skills that they knew, that they had brought with them, had been oftentimes been purchased for the particular agricultural or physical skills that they had. And then as free people, were not allowed to ply their trades lest they be successful.
Mm. Now, you have ancestors who were laundresses, Pullman porters, maids, postal workers. Any vignettes you would like to share with our audience about them?
Yeah, I talk in the book, I trace the stories of my ancestors to talk about those professions that, were so central to the construction of a Black working class ethic. I talk about my grandmother, a woman named Brunelle Duncan, who migrates first from South Carolina, then to Thomasville, North Carolina, and then to Philadelphia. Unfortunately, in the process of moving, she was seeking out white collar employment. She had gotten her high school education in Thomasville. But when she moves to Philadelphia in the late 1930s, she can only find a job as working as a maid for a white household, a live-in maid, having to leave my mother during the week. And so her story of disappointment, her story of hard work and sacrifice is one that we often haven't told in the sort of working class story of the Great Migration. And one I wanted to elevate because my grandmother was like millions of other Black women who continue to have to work in household work in order to make a living, even after the migration, for in many cases for a decade or more.
Any stories to share about the Pullman porter? For example, I understand that C.L. Dellums, who was a relative of the late Congressman Ronald V. Dellums of Oakland, Berkeley, figures in your pages.
Yes, I found a beautiful set of oral histories with him that I use that were conducted in the 1980s, that I used to talk about his life, his growing up in Texas, his brother's engulfment in the Tulsa massacre, and him having to go there to try and save his brother's life, which he does successfully. And then his choice to move to California, and this beautiful, poignant story of a Pullman porter asking him where he was going. And his original plan was to go to San Francisco. And the porter's like, well, where are you going there? You know, who are you going to stay with? Who's going to help you there? And really guiding him to Oakland, helping him find a place to stay and setting him up with what became his career as a Pullman porter, and then as a tremendously important union organizer for Pullman, really helping to construct the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which becomes probably the most important union activism in the 20th century. The first all-Black union that not only organizes for train workers, this all-Black cadre of Black men and women who work on the sleeping cars of interstate trains, but also really forming the foundation of civil rights and a generation of activism in the March on Washington movement. And so C.L. Dellums' willingness to share his very personal story becomes one of the oral histories that I draw on to talk about Black folk.
Now, in one of your previous comments, you used the phrase Black working class ethic. What did you mean by that?
I think what's interesting is, we often are telling the story of America as a very independent one, that most Americans are, great because of their individualism. They pull up on their own bootstraps. These bootstraps must be very tired by now. And their story of success is really grounded in an individual triumph. For the Black working class, that's not what you see. You see a collective ethic. You see a willingness to look out for one another, to bond together, to commiserate, to plan, and to support each other. And it's how they survived slavery. It's how they survived Jim Crow, the migration, discrimination, gentrification in this generation. And the profound way in which they are able to carve out a different way of thinking about success and triumphs over time. And so for me, that is not a natural thing. It is a thing that's born of the struggle and the adversity that African descendants have to survive. But it is something they carry with them and makes them unique and distinctive, and becomes a story of how we can support each other as Americans now, if we use it as an example.
I think a moment or two ago, you mentioned your ancestor, Brunel. Elaborate upon Brunel, and also Solicitor. Who was Solicitor?
Solicitor was my great-grandfather. His story of, he was a sharecropper in a place called Comer, Georgia. And when my grandfather was a young teenager, he escaped sharecropping in the middle of the night, having to run when the landholder told him that he owed money at the end of a season. And this story is really sort of the origin story of my family's migration, a story my mother told me very frequently, my grandfather told me, my grandmother told me. And they wanted me to know that they came north not because they weren't successful or capable, but because they had suffered from tremendous injustice, and that they had something with them, though, that there was meaning in their family, there was meaning in that story, and that willingness to survive. And so I start Black folk with Solicitor's story of escape as a free man in the beginning of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is the Center for the Study of the American South, which you direct?
Well, it's a study at a center at UNC that's about 30 years old. We're celebrating our anniversary this year. And it houses a journal called Southern Cultures, and it houses the Southern Oral History Project and a team of researchers who are working to capture and collect and share the stories of the American South. I'm excited to be the first Black woman to head the center in its 30-year history. And I'm hopeful that we can continue a powerful legacy of collecting the stories of the South, but while we broaden what we consider the story of the American South, and create a more inclusive and broad and rich vision of what's possible in this region in the future.
So, speaking of which, what's next on the research agenda for Professor Kelley?
I think I want to keep writing about the Black working class. I really consider Black folk to be the generation of my grandparents, starting with my grandfather when he was very young and ending, for the most part, when he is a successful older man. I would like to think about the generation of my father, the generation that's really dealing with integration and its aftermath, and trying to figure out how we get to our sort of gig economy of today. And so I'm thinking about that as a next project. I also have a murder case that I want to write about. And I want to write about the folks in Texas and the Juneteenth celebrations and emancipation. So I have a bunch of things on my plate. I don't know where they all fit, but I'll figure it out, I guess.
What is the murder case, if you don't mind?
The murder case is a woman named Corrine Sykes, who ends up murdering the white woman she cleans house for in 1944 in Philadelphia. And so my parents were small children in the city. My grandmother was working as a domestic maid at the time. And so I want to tell the story from the point of view of Black Philadelphians in 1944.
So, Professor Kelley, you are Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor in Southern Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, author of the book Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. What advice would you give to young Black girls who would like to walk in your footsteps in the 21st century?
I would say to listen to the stories of your ancestors, to ask your grandparents questions, to maybe record them as they talk, to take notes, to ask them to narrate the pictures they have in their collections. Because for me, remembering that history is rooted in our everyday experiences is so important, and we'll lose something if we don't capture the stories of the older folks around us. And so those stories were the root of how I began thinking of myself as a historian. And so I think it's a wonderful way to understand how history works today.
Mm-hmm. So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Kelley. Joel R. Williamson, Distinguished Professor in Southern Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, author of the book Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thanks for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assunta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And now for our prison radio commentaries.
Remembering Move on film and in life. How do we remember Move? Well, It depends on how we met them or first learned about them. By that I mean, what form of media did you consume to learn about Mo? If you read local papers at the time, you probably detested Mo. For the papers did their level best to dehumanize Mo, and in fact, to demonize him. But if you viewed the film Mo, Confrontation in Philadelphia, I bet you had a more nuanced and perhaps more positive point of view. For the film allowed Mo people to speak their own minds. And once it got banned by Temple University, I resolved to liberate it and let the people of the city see it in its entirety. And when people, regular people, saw the film, it blew them away. For here were moved people not just in brief sound bites, but in extended discussions, giving their ideas, insights, and arguments. In a word, the film humanized Mo. The film broke through the demonization imposed by the local press and helped build support for the MOVE organization and their fight for freedom. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Hello, everybody at prisonradio.org. This is Chad Smith. We truly need more prison reform nonprofit organizations saving lives and making an impact and change in the world, fighting the battles that matter, and fighting for those who are unfairly abused by the police and court system, often left voiceless. I'm talking about us people who have very legitimate issues of fact, not just merely complaining. Facts that once looked into by anyone truly trying to help and bring about a lasting change, and whistleblower issues that will immediately take the front page of every impacted newspaper and headlines of every news channel. The things this Wayne County Judicial Court system of Detroit is doing to myself and countless others is cruelty for profit and a cover-up to protect corrupt police and the corrupt prosecution system in Detroit, Michigan. You've all seen how far the Detroit police system and city officials went to cover up the corruption involving the once Detroit Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick. When will police corruption be held accountable and rooted out? When will the judicial system of Wayne County be held accountable for their inhumane atrocities against the inhabitants who reside in that community? I was a hard-working, tax-paying citizen enjoying family life and society, and now I have been shot by the police several times, almost killed by the police to be exact, non-provokingly, due to policemen's wild state of fear and confusion when dealing with young men of color like myself. You can see in the copies of the police lethal force report that I sent to Tony how one of the officers on the police shooting scene reported and confessed that I did nothing worthy of police lethal force or being shot by multiple police officers. A mere police firing squad death sentence they brought up on me. This report was hidden along with multiple missing body camera footage of 4 officers. This police officer who confessed was never called as a witness at the one-man grand jury indictment or probable cause hearing for the indictment. And I'm wondering why. And to add insult to injury of being shot by the police, I was arrested on a warrantless arrest at the hospital, taken out of the hospital but never booked in jail, and instead placed in a secret facility hidden away from inquiring media and news for holding without permission of a warrant or detainer. I was also totally taken advantage of, being illegally interrogated there under the influence of strong pain drugs while in critical conditions, suffering from a lack of proper hospice treatment. Since this all happened on the date of August 3rd, 2018, I have been in custody without any crime convictions for the indictment, allegations of police, and the prosecution. I'm trying to fight the indictment in the Wayne County Judicial Court, where several attempts has been made to cover this up and sweep me under a system against my constitutional citizen rights of justice. As I stated in previous recordings, so many of my rights have been severely abused throughout this ongoing court process. Public attorneys are working with the prosecutor behind my back to cover this all up. All body cams footage of shooting officers has been hidden and has disappeared. Court transcripts of my so-called arraignment is missing. Probable cause hearing transcripts are missing. An alleged victim never filed and or signed a complaint or affidavit, and they are both non-existent, yet I was still charged. All blatant plain errors, yet continually ignored. There's been so many violations in this case and so much unreasonable time delay causing me added prejudices in the case due to corrupt prosecutions, tactical advantage, and so much more. I'm still in the pretrial phases of this case, and I am in desperate need of a real attorney and some civil rights help. I welcome all legitimate legal help. As an American taxpaying citizen, I just want my rights respected to a fair court's proceeding as promised in the United States Constitution. Are all created equal as promised, or what? All I'm saying is this thing stinks all the way around. I have all the facts, not complaints. I have all the facts. I'm not complaining. All I know, with any true lawyer, one good motion can get this case dismissed with prejudice and get me back home to my loved ones immediately. It's that simple. One motion can save a life. So I just thank everybody that's been supporting me. I thank prisonradio.org, man. Y'all keep me in prayer and please reach out to me. Thank you.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Crystal Lynn Webster, Associate Professor of History at the University of British Columbia in Canada, author of the book Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, African American Children in the Antebellum North. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Webster.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
So I came to this project mainly out of my own experience working with Black children. I was a school teacher in the rural South in Clarksdale, Mississippi for fourth graders, and it was an all-Black school. And I was really fascinated by the world that the children made for themselves and how we as adults rarely had access to that world or rarely had a kind of accurate understanding of that world. I found it to be quite a rich, complicated, and also difficult world to interact with as an outsider, as an adult. I thought as a Black woman, I'd sort of be able to jump right in, but it proved to be more complicated than that. And from that experience, soon after, I was lucky enough to attend a PhD program in Black Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And where I was allowed me access to research archives throughout the northeastern United States, which gave me insight to the experience of freedom, slavery, and emancipation for African Americans. But what I quickly noticed was that this experience, especially in places like Pennsylvania, really operated around the lives of Black children because of the process of gradual emancipation. So these kind of two interests came together, this interest in Black children and their lives and really bringing depth and also bringing political agency to their lives and their worlds, as well as my research and my access to the research archives where I was. And so I wrote Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, really taking up this distinct experience of particularly gradual emancipation, but also Black children's antebellum experiences in the U.S. North. And the book argues that through the process of indenture, Black children were suspended between slavery and emancipation, and they did not fit within these newly establishing categories of child and adult, and they were sort of outside. And because they're outside, they've kind of been marginalized both within our historical knowledge and scholarship, and also marginalized at the time in a way that we haven't really fully grappled with. So this project took up that experience and took up Black childhood and argued that Black children claimed childhood as a political act of resistance, and in doing so, challenged their exploitation of their labor and their exploitation through the process of indentured servitude throughout the U.S. North.
Could you elaborate on that latter point? That is to say, how were Black children social and political actors in the antebellum North?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ways that I got at this were thinking about how Black children activate or access this new category of childhood. And this new category of childhood that emerged at the time during the early 19th century was one of privilege and one of protection. And so Black children in various ways try to be seen as children and therefore get the kind of political protection that this category allowed, while also being Black and while, like I said, they're part of these institutional structures like indentured servitude. So I refer to this in the book as the ways that they access the metaphysical space of childhood through their movement and through their negotiation of different states. So some of the states of childhood that I talk about are dependency or innocence, and how they try to kind of claim that at different moments. And then the spaces that I talk about are kind of the physical spaces that children now increasingly occupy, spaces like schools or orphanages or juvenile reformatories. Their negotiation of those spaces, their attempts to sometimes be in those spaces, sometimes leave those spaces. And in doing so, this process is creating new ideas of childhood, new questioning and challenging prevailing ideas of childhood, and gaining access to, for Black children, to forms of protection. And that this was quite a sophisticated process that required shrewd negotiation, which I argue is political, but that it also exposes them to new forms of violence, that once they're in and recognized in some of these spaces, they're exposed to new forms of violence, violence of abuse, violence of exploitation, exclusion, or confinement, or even in tragic cases, death from illness and otherwise violent things.
So you talk about how Black children are seeking the privileges that non-Black children have with regard to childhood and seeking the protection that non-Black children had. And so my question is, does that struggle continue to this very day?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the insights that I learned from the book is that the struggle doesn't look the way that we think it does as adults, that we have to really pay attention to the thoughts and needs and desires of children from child-centered worldviews. One of the things that I think a lot about are schools, especially I saw this happening a lot during the pandemic moment of children doing school from home. I think that children's attempts to either go to school or to not go to school, I think, are political acts that we should be paying more attention to and thinking more about. One story in the book in the 19th century that really resonates with me today is a group of students at a Philadelphia Abolitionist Society school who the teacher was paying close attention to their attendance records, noticing they didn't want to come to school, even though obviously as part of the abolitionist movement, it's about schooling and about giving access to education and schooling, and that often children don't want to come. And for these children in these spaces, at times school was dangerous. The walk to school could be dangerous or hazardous. And also their ideas of learning and their ideas of having autonomy over their education was quite different than what we had or what abolitionists had imagined for them. And I think that that really resonates in a lot of different ways today about where children want to occupy space, why and why not, and how we as adults could pay more attention to that.
Hmm. Now, to what extent were Black children institutionalized in orphanages and reformatories? And were they disproportionately institutionalized? And if so, was racism a factor in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the children that I look at in the orphanages mainly in Pennsylvania and New York could be institutionalized either through the loss of both parents or the loss of one parent. And if they were institutionalized through the loss of one parent, then the reformers who are running the schools were making the decisions about whether or not they believed the child should be admitted to the orphanage. And if they were, I guess there could be a third option, which is that they could be institutionalized because a parent could not be found or because there were assumptions about families not being present. And as we know, for Black families within households in the North, to an extent throughout the slave South, kinship networks look quite different. And especially for outsiders kind of looking in on those networks, they might not map onto traditional understandings of what families should or do look like. And so I did find cases of children whose mothers surrendered them at a time to an orphanage because a father may have died or because they themselves were transitioning from slavery to emancipation, needing to gain kind of economic foothold and stability. And so they surrendered their children to orphanages, assuming they could come back and get them after a period of time, and then had to come up against these the people running the orphanages who then refused to give up guardianship of the children, or at that point, the children could have been indentured out. So it becomes a really difficult process for families and children who do have families and kinship networks. And a direct legacy of this, I believe, is the current child welfare system and services, which now run by the state, is very much a part of a kind of wider carceral policing network. And Dorothy Roberts has a great book on this recently. So we see the kind of early assumptions and perceptions that are certainly racialized happening during the Antebellum North about Black families that then become some of these long-standing understandings of the Black family and basically pathologizing Black families and Black mothers.
Now, quite infamously, there were episodes where racist mobs attacked defenseless children in orphanages in Philadelphia in 1838 and New York City in 1863. Describe those racist attacks and reflect upon one of the points that emerges from Native American studies, which is the idea that when Native American children were attacked and slaughtered, those who were doing the attacking and slaughtering, be they state actors or non-state actors, took the proposition that nits make lice. That is to say, the problem with Native American children is that they grow up to be Native American adults. Was there a similar process involved in these attacks on Black orphanages?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the first attack in Philadelphia comes with the burning of Pennsylvania Hall. So it's really wrapped up in a kind of anti-abolitionist and kind of very visible abolitionist activism in the city, which is Pennsylvania Hall, and also the school and the orphanage, which are very much sort of attached to abolitionist activism at the time. And so I think it's very clearly a kind of backlash against anti-racist, well, not necessarily anti-racist, anti-slavery activism at the time. But I also think that certainly in attacking Black children, but also kind of wrapped up in what they're attacking about abolitionism is kind of the future place of Black folk in the city. as future citizens and the kind of potential. And there's so much to be said about how children represent potential. And I see this both in the attacks on children, these physical attacks on children, but also in the attempts to restrict them to these places of dependency. So another really important argument of the book is that in placing children in orphanages that indenture children out, and in sort of prolonging emancipation for Black folk in generally, that what's happening is that they're prolonging Black children's access to adulthood and the kind of benefits of adulthood. And particularly for states like Pennsylvania, which have gradual emancipation happening until children are in their late 20s, that actually is quite different than I think what people might assume for maturity, that when maybe they reach 18 and now they can be emancipated. But in a lot of cases, people are much later or much older before they're even emancipated. And so I think that these attacks on children are very kind of physical acts of that, but that we also have this kind of institutional and structural attack on childhood and really dependency and keeping Black people in dependency for as long as they can, in both cases in Pennsylvania and in the New York draft riots.
Now, were the experiences of Black children gendered? That is to say, were there differences in the experiences of Black girls versus Black boys?
Yes, absolutely. One of the most disturbing things that I found were advertisements for Black children's labor, where I saw very clear gendered treatment of Black children in ways that were pretty horrifying. So requests for labor for indentured servants that specifically asked for light-skinned girls, beautiful girls, girls that were easy to bring up, or orphan girls in particular. So I think without having a kind of archive that explains or is explicit about racial violence or sexual abuse, I think that Black children, Black girls were particularly vulnerable, and these kind of advertisements show maybe a kind of undercurrent of sexualization that is disturbing. I also saw very clear examples of gendered treatment within many of these institutions, the kind of labor that children were performing, and kind of what would be referred to as skilled labor for boys versus skilled labor for girls. But this kind of worked in an unexpected way. Boys actually, when they were Black, performed more unskilled labor that was similar to what Black girls were learning as trades. So both Black boys and Black girls were learning domestic labor instead of skilled labor as blacksmiths or otherwise labor that we would kind of assign to apprenticeship. So those were the main two ways that I saw gendered experiences for Black children in ways that exploited both Black girls and Black boys differently.
So what conclusions do you draw about Black parenthood from your research, Professor Webster?
Yeah, so for the families that I encounter in the book, I see really creative and powerful ways that Black families and Black kinship networks are working to protect Black children. And I see ways that these networks were challenged, but also ways that they were successful. And one of the examples of this is through labor through the chimney sweeps, which I was surprised to find in New York, the kind of internal chimney sweep, master sweep, and apprenticeship network between Black men and Black boys, which felt very much involved and very much in control, and in a way that was to protect Black boys from other kinds of industries, even though that industry was quite a harmful industry. So that was a kind of structural way that Black families were protecting Black children. And then more broadly, in resisting abuse or resisting exploitation, particularly in the schooling movement. So Black families and Black parents were those mainly involved in the response to abuse of children in Boston, which led to the desegregation of Boston public schools, and a really powerful movement that mobilized around Black children, and a kind of movement that also broke away from paternalistic abolitionist ideas of schooling. So that was a really interesting moment where I feel like Black parents and Black families really listened to Black children and centered them over adults.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Webster, author of the book Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood, African American Children in the Antebellum North. What's next on your research agenda? What do your loyal readers have to look forward to?
Well, I'm currently writing a book called Condemned: How America's Courts and Prisons Terrorized Black Children. And so it's a natural extension from this first book, where I was shocked to find Black children in the earliest adult prisons of the United States. So it really centers their stories and guides readers to the conclusion that the criminal justice system really is structured around the disturbing and unacknowledged criminalization of Black children. So look for that soon enough.
So you're saying that Black children were in adult prisons. Were these Black boys and Black girls? And how young are we talking about these kids?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so ranging from as young as 12, Black boys and Black girls. The book begins with some of the earliest cases of the death penalty in the United States, and the very disturbing detail that the youngest person ever executed was a Black girl in Connecticut in 1786, who was only 12 years old. She was 12.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. So partly because of what Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood discovers, this kind of new treatment of of childhood in general, Black children were not protected as children in the criminal justice system. And the book is showing that the kind of creativity of the criminal justice system to punish so severely Black children, regardless of their age, was one of the earliest kind of ways that it became flexible yet rigid in ways that we understand it today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Webster, Associate Professor of History at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, author of the book Beyond the Boundaries of Childhood. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Ditto.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests. Thank you, Dr. Blair Kelley. Thank you, Dr. Crystal Lynn Webster. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, and all those who made today's program possible. Thank you to our board op window. Please stay tuned for our Sister Assumpta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.